I've always loved the quiet. That's the real reason I camp alone and hike alone. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about the silence. The kind of silence that presses against you like a weight, smoothing out the chaos of everyday life. Out here, far from deadlines and the blaring traffic, I can hear my own thoughts. But it's a fragile thing. The peace that the wilderness offers. I've learned that the quiet can also play tricks on you, turn on you. That's what happened to me in the San Juan National Forest. I'd been camping alone plenty of times before, but this trip was different. I still have trouble putting it into words. All I know is that the silence stopped being my friend somewhere on the second day. I'd planned to be out there for 4 days, just long enough to clear my head and reset. The spot I'd picked was remote, a stretch of dense forest near Pagosa Springs that even the locals didn't visit often. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went like it always does. The drive up was uneventful, and after a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect campsite. It was tucked away by a creek, surrounded by towering pines, with a small clearing just big enough for my tent and fire pit. I felt that familiar rush of excitement as I set up camp, the freedom of being out here completely alone, with nothing but wilderness around me. That first night was easy. I sat by the fire, listening to the water rush over the rocks in the creek. I wrote in my journal a bit, mostly just notes about the hike and some thoughts about work. Then I crawled into my tent, ready to sleep. The silence was comforting at first, as it always is. But I woke up in the middle of the night to something strange. It was subtle, just a faint whispering sound, like the wind picking up through the trees. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, things started to go wrong. I woke up later than I'd planned, the sky already a pale blue overhead. My stove was acting up, which was weird because it had worked fine the night before. It just wouldn't light, no matter what I tried. I ended up eating cold granola and packing up my camp, ready to move deeper into the forest. That's when I noticed my GPS wasn't working. I'd had reception when I camped here before, but now my phone was useless, no signal at all. I wasn't worried yet, though. I'd brought a map, and I knew the area well enough to navigate without technology. Still, the feeling that something wasn't right settled in, and I couldn't shake it. The hike was harder than I expected. My legs felt heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds or the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, but today, it was just still. The silence felt unnatural. I found another campsite by late afternoon, a little further into the woods next to a meadow that looked untouched. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going, but as I worked, the feeling of being watched crept up on me. I couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, nothing was there, just trees and shadows, but the sensation wouldn't leave. That night, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and they weren't random. They were saying something. My name. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, drifting on the breeze from somewhere just beyond the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shone the light into the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, the fire flickering in the corner of my vision. I stood there for a long time listening, but the whispering had stopped. It was just the wind. It had to be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept much the night before, and the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. My gear wasn't cooperating either. When I tried to pack up my tent, I found that the poles had bent. They were new, barely used, but somehow they were warped, like something had twisted them while I slept. It didn't make sense. The whispering was back too, even during the day. It followed me as I hiked, a faint sound on the edge of hearing, like someone walking just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone out here. Then there was the whistling. It started around midday, just after I'd set up my third camp. At first, I thought it was a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, a high, clear note that echoed through the trees. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I called out, hoping it was another hiker, someone who'd stumbled across my camp, but there was no response. just silence. I tried to stay calm, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Now it felt like something was circling me, just beyond my vision, waiting. That night, the whispers didn't stop. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening as the sound of my name drifted through the trees. It was faint at first, like it had been the night before, but as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent. Dylan? I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I scanned the trees, heart racing, but there was nothing, just darkness. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too big to be an animal, and it was moving too deliberately, like it was watching me, waiting. I turned off my flashlight and backed into the tent, my mind racing. I'd never been this scared in the woods before, not once in all the years I'd camped alone. But now there was something out there. I could feel it. I zipped the tent shut and tried to calm my breathing, but the whispers were inside my head now. They weren't just outside. They were all around me. Dylan, Dylan. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent, clutching the flashlight, listening as the whispers circled me. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, sometimes several, but it was always the same soft, insistent calling my name. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out of these woods. But as I started hiking, the whistling began again. This time, it was closer, following me like something was walking just behind me, whistling a slow, eerie tune. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to see whatever it was. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I was practically running down the trail. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned around. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, and its lips were curled into a grin. It stood there, staring at me, its head cocked to the side as if amused. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whistling had stopped, and now there was only silence. A silence so thick, it pressed down on me like a weight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually I turned and ran. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead where my car was parked. When I finally looked back, the figure was gone. I never told anyone what happened in the San Juan National Forest. Not really. I tried to explain it to myself 1,000 different ways. Exhaustion, anxiety, maybe even altitude sickness. But none of that explains the whispers, or the whistling, or the figure that watched me from the trees. I haven't been camping since. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I had heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one that locals said disappeared and reappeared as though it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it and film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera and set it up, filming a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on the damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket, just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore were fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground. Its surface covered in symbols, strange spiraling shapes that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving, the trees closing in tighter. The trail I was following became fainter, more overgrown, and soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping my camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment there had been a clear path, and now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The mist curled around the trees, thick and almost suffocating. But I was certain I'd been on the right trail. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed that I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, standing alone in the fog. "Okay," I muttered. "You've dealt with worse." I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it, footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. The sound came from deeper in the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path, it's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look," I said, pulling out my GPS. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get him some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago was now choked with brambles. When I looked back, the trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees, thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and then the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us. The forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside. Water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around as though he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whispers growing louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around, and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen, shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove off, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me. And I had a feeling it was waiting, somewhere in the mist, for me to return. I wasn't supposed to be here, not really. Not in this forest, not sitting in this RV, staring at the tall trees outside, wondering if this trip would be my last. Ford Pinot National Forest had been Karen's idea years ago. She had this way of looking at the world, seeing the beauty in everything. She wanted to camp here, hike the trails, soak in the stillness of the ancient trees. I didn't get it then, too caught up in work, too busy to care. But now it was all I had left. It had been a year since she died, and I still couldn't make sense of it. A car accident on a quiet street. Just like that, she was gone, and I was left stumbling through life, trying to figure out how to exist without her. This trip was my last attempt at finding something, anything that made sense. So here I was, parked deep in the middle of nowhere, hoping that the forest would somehow offer answers. I didn't know what else to do. The trees stretched up into the sky, their thick trunks casting shadows that lingered even in the daylight. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt empty without her. I could almost hear her voice telling me to look at the wildflowers or marvel at the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. I stepped out of the RV. The cool, damp air wrapped around me. The scent of pine and moss was thick, earthy. Everything seemed so alive, and yet all I could feel was the weight of the past pressing down on me. I started a small fire, just like I'd done the past few nights, and sat there watching the flames dance. The crackling wood was the only sound in the stillness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the fire, but distinct enough to make me stand up, heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe some other animal, but the feeling stuck. The sense that someone was watching me. I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to shake the unease, but it lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man I'd met the day before. Edgar. He'd been wandering the campground when I arrived, his wrinkled face covered in a scruffy beard, eyes sharp despite his age. He was friendly enough, but there had been something off about him. "You came at the wrong time," he'd said, staring at me with a knowing look. "Why is that?" I'd asked, brushing it off. Some things shouldn't be disturbed, especially at night. The forest, it has its secrets. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't respond. But his words stuck with me, replaying in my mind as I sat by the fire. What did he mean by secrets? What was he talking about? I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, sitting in the dark with the fire flickering low, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to what he'd said. The wind picked up, making the trees sway, their branches creaking overhead. The fire sputtered as the breeze caught it, and I stood up again, feeling restless. I needed to move, to walk, anything to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the forest, just far enough to feel like I was doing something. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the trees, but casting long shadows everywhere else. My footsteps were the only sound now, crunching softly on the forest floor. I don't know how far I walked before I saw the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a spiral-like shape that looked old, weathered by time. I crouched down, running my fingers over it. It was smooth, unnaturally so, like it had been carved recently. I stood up, shining the light around, and spotted more symbols carved into the trees at odd intervals, spirals, faces, shapes that made no sense. They all seemed to be pointing deeper into the forest, like a trail leading me somewhere. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, trying to ignore the nagging curiosity that pulled at me. I wasn't here to chase after strange carvings. I was here to... Well, I didn't know why I was here anymore, but this wasn't it. As I made my way back toward the RV, the air seemed heavier, colder. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, and the shadows seemed darker. The feeling that I was being watched returned, stronger this time, like someone or something was following me. My pulse quickened, and I picked up the pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Nothing, just trees and shadows. When I reached the RV, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fire had gone out, leaving nothing but smoldering embers. I climbed inside, locked the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, heart still racing. I was just tired. That's all it was. The grief, the isolation, it was messing with my head. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the loneliness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. At least that's what I told myself. The next morning, I met Leah. She was hiking near the campground, a pack slung over her shoulders, looking every bit the confident outdoors woman. She was friendly, outgoing, and struck up a conversation with me as soon as we crossed paths. "You camping out here alone?" she asked, her voice light, casual. I nodded. "Yeah, needed some time away, I guess." "I get that," she said, smiling. "This place is something else. It's beautiful, but it can get a little weird at night, don't you think?" I paused, remembering the footsteps, the carvings, Edgar's warnings. "Weird?" I asked. "How strange it can feel out here after dark. Just stories, old legends. You know how it is with places like this. Every forest has its ghost stories." I tried to keep my tone neutral, but the unease from the night before still lingered. She smiled again, but this time there was something in her eyes, like she knew more than she was letting on. "Just be careful. It's easy to get lost out here," she said. With that, she waved and continued down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I watched her go, wondering if I should have said more, asked her what she meant, but I didn't. I spent the rest of the day at camp, trying to relax, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. That night, as I sat by the fire again, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols. They'd seemed so deliberate, so purposeful, like someone or something was trying to lead me deeper into the woods. And then the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing. Just shadows. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the RV, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. My throat tightened as I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, but the footsteps didn't answer. Instead, they stopped, dead silence. I backed toward the RV, fumbling for the door, when I saw it. Movement, just at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. I blinked, and it was gone. I bolted inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in short gasps. What the hell was happening? I sat there for hours, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, Leah was gone. Her tent was still there, her pack sitting neatly outside, but she was nowhere to be found. I searched the area, calling her name, but the forest was silent. It didn't make sense. People didn't just vanish like that, not without a trace. I thought about Edgar, about the stories he'd told. The forgotten one, he'd called it. A legend about a man who'd wandered too far into the forest, losing himself until he became part of the land itself. Now, they said, he lured others to join him, preying on their grief, their loneliness, until they disappeared too. I didn't believe it. I couldn't. But Leah was gone, and the symbols were still there, etched into the trees like a warning or an invitation. The footsteps returned that night, and this time, I knew what they wanted. I could hear her voice, Karen's voice, calling to me from the trees. Soft, loving, like she was right there waiting for me. "Derek," she whispered, "come find me." My heart ached, torn between the impossible and the undeniable. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it, but I wanted to believe it was. I stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin. The forest was dark, silent, but the voice was there, guiding me. I walked toward the trees, my feet moving on their own, drawn by the sound of her voice. "Derek," she called again. "Don't leave me." I stopped at the edge of the woods, staring into the darkness. I could see her now, just beyond the first row of trees, her face, her smile. She was there, waiting for me. But something was wrong. The shadows around her shifted, twisting like they were alive. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, were hollow, empty. I took a step back, the spell breaking. This wasn't Karen. I turned and ran back to the RV, back to safety. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in as the voice grew louder, angrier. "Derek!" I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear her screaming my name from the trees, but I didn't go back. I couldn't. I left Gifford Pinot the next morning, the RV's engine sputtering to life as I drove away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The forest had its secrets. I wasn't meant to know them. And whatever it was out there, whatever the Forgotten One truly was, it would stay there, waiting for someone else. I thought the desert would heal me. Red Rock Canyon was supposed to be a place to clear my head, to sit in silence and let the vast, empty land take away the chaos of the last few months. I'd lost everything, my wife, my job, and I needed something, anything, to remind me there was still some peace left in the world. Instead, it felt like I'd driven into a nightmare. I parked the RV at the far end of the campground, as far away from the few other campers as I could get. I wanted solitude, to think, or maybe to stop thinking. I wasn't sure. The sun was setting as I stepped out, casting a deep orange glow across the red sandstone cliffs. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that made you feel small, like the world was too big for you to matter. Maybe that's what I needed. I'd been driving for hours, with only the occasional crackle of the radio for company. The RV was old, creaking and groaning as I navigated the winding roads into the canyon. It had seen better days, much like me. As I stretched, a low rumble came from under the hood. "Great," I muttered, giving the RV a half-hearted kick. The engine had been acting up for days, but I figured I could deal with it later. I wasn't here for that. I was here to get away, to let the emptiness of the desert swallow me whole. That night, after I'd settled in, I sat outside the RV, staring up at the stars. Out here, away from the city, the sky was incredible, clear, endless. But as the stars twinkled overhead, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought they were planes, blinking in and out far above the canyon. But then they moved too fast, too erratically. I leaned forward, squinting. There were 3 of them, glowing faintly blue, darting through the sky in impossible patterns. They weren't planes. I wasn't sure what they were. I stood up, straining my neck to follow their path as they circled overhead. They blinked off one by one, and the desert was silent again. Just stars, I told myself, even though I knew it wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find the RV's battery almost dead. My phone, which I'd left charging overnight, hadn't gained a single bar. I tried turning the engine over, but all I got was a dull click. My chest tightened. Being stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't part of the plan. I had enough food and water for a few days, sure, but the isolation was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. Milo's RV was parked a few spots down, his beat-up RV sitting in the shade of a large rock formation. He waved me over as I stepped out of mine, a wide grin on his sunburnt face. "Morning," he called. "Beautiful day, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Hey, you wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" Milo scratched his scruffy chin, then shook his head. "Sorry, friend, but I can give you a ride into town later if you need help. It's not too far." I thanked him, but something about Milo unsettled me. Maybe it was how relaxed he seemed, like this place wasn't bothering him at all. As I stood there, he tilted his head toward the canyon walls. "You see the lights last night?" he asked. I froze. "Yeah, what were they?" He shrugged, like it was nothing. Oh, those things. People talk about them all the time. That could be military, could be something else. No one really knows, but they've been around as long as I've been camping out here. I laughed nervously. Something else? Huh? Milo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. People say they're not from this world. I don't know about that, but sometimes they follow you. Just don't go too far out at night and you'll be fine. I forced another laugh, but my stomach churned. Milo's tone was too casual, too accepting. I thanked him again and went back to my RV, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something important. The day dragged on, the heat baking the ground beneath my feet. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the campground, trying to clear my head, but the vast emptiness only made me feel more alone. I kept thinking about the lights, about how they'd moved, how they seemed to watch me. That night, they returned. I was sitting outside again, nursing a warm beer and staring at the sky when I saw them, 3 faint blue lights hovering over the canyon. This time, they were closer. Too close. They flickered almost playfully, darting back and forth like they were searching for something. I stood up, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I backed toward the RV, never taking my eyes off the lights, but as I reached for the door, the lights blinked out. Gone. Just like that. A cold breeze swept through the canyon, and I shivered. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the dead, suffocating silence of the desert. Then the RV lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the RV, fumbling for the flashlight. I clicked it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. The electrical panel was dead, and my phone wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing, and I had no idea why. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. "Chris, you okay?" It was Emily, the hiker I'd met earlier that day. She'd pitched her tent nearby, planning to stay for a few nights before heading out. I opened the door, trying to hide my panic. "Yeah, just some electrical issues," I said, forcing a smile. "Everything's dead. I'm guessing the battery's shot." Emily frowned, glancing back at her tent. "That's weird. My phone's dead too, and my flashlight keeps flickering." Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the strangeness in the air, the weight of the silence. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think it's the lights?" Milo told me about them earlier, said people disappear sometimes. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Disappear?" Emily nodded, her gaze drifting toward the canyon. "Yeah, it's mostly stories, but you seemed pretty convinced." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, heavy, like the desert was closing in on us. I wasn't sure if I believed in Milo's campfire tales, but the lights, they were real, and they weren't natural. "We should get out of here," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I don't like this." "I can't," I replied. "My RV won't start." She hesitated, then nodded. "Mine either. I tried earlier, but it's completely dead." We stood there, staring at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something was wrong with this place. The lights weren't just an oddity. They were doing something, affecting everything around us. And we were stuck miles from any help. "We'll wait till morning," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe it's just a temporary glitch. We'll figure it out." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded and headed back to her tent. I locked the RV door behind her, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. That night, I barely slept. The silence was oppressive, like a blanket wrapped too tight around me. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept waiting for the lights to come back, to hover outside my window, but they didn't. Instead, I woke up sometime in the early hours, drenched in sweat, my head pounding. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. Something was wrong. I glanced at my watch. It was 4 a.m., but that didn't make sense. I'd checked the time just moments ago, and it had been midnight. Where had the hours gone? I stumbled outside, feeling disoriented. The air was cooler now, the desert's chill settling in. The stars were out, but there was no sign of the lights. My mind was foggy, like I'd been dreaming. But the dust on my boots told me I'd been walking. But where? And why? Panic surged through me. I couldn't remember. Hours were missing, and I had no idea what had happened. The lights were playing with us, toying with our sense of reality. I ran toward Emily's tent, calling her name, but when I got there, she was gone. Her tent was empty, her pack still there, but she was nowhere to be found. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. Nothing. The only sound was the wind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the lights, the missing time, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. We weren't alone. I sprinted back to my RV, slamming the door behind me, and tried the engine again. To my shock, it roared to life. The headlights flickered on, and I didn't hesitate. I jammed the gear shift into drive and tore out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the winding canyon road. I glanced in the rearview mirror for just a second. I saw them, the blue lights, hovering in the distance, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I hit the outskirts of Las Vegas. The neon lights of the city felt like a lifeline. But even then, as I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were still out there, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I'd really escaped at all. "6 months in the Smokies. 6 months. 6 whole months without touching a drop." I should have been proud, right? But sitting alone in this RV, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, I didn't feel proud. I felt restless, empty, even the kind of empty that creeps up on you, settling in your bones when there's nothing but the sound of your own thoughts bouncing around your skull. This trip was supposed to be a celebration, a gift to myself for staying clean. I thought the solitude would help me clear my head, maybe give me some perspective. The Smokies had always been a place of peace for me. My dad used to take me camping here when I was a kid, back when life was simple, before the bottle got its hooks into me. I pulled out my phone, flicking through pictures of those old trips. My thumb hesitated over the last photo of my dad and me standing by a roaring campfire. That was before everything went to hell, before the drinking became my escape from everything I couldn't face. The phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. It was my brother Jake, checking in as usual. "Hey man," he said when I answered. "How's the trip? You hanging in there?" Jake was always the responsible one. Clean cut, married with kids, a steady job. He'd been my lifeline after the wreckage of my addiction. I owed him more than I could ever repay. "Yeah, it's good," I lied. "Just me and the trees. Peaceful." "You staying out of trouble?" I chuckled. "I'm not exactly near any temptations out here," I said. I didn't tell him about the bottle I'd brought with me. It sat in the back of the RV, unopened but still there, just in case. A cruel comfort. I'd stared at it more than once already, the amber liquid calling to me in the quiet. "Good to hear," Jake said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Just keep your head straight, all right? I know it's tough being out there alone, but you got this. Call me if you need anything." "I will. Thanks." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky faded from a soft orange to deep purple, and with it, the familiar sense of isolation began to settle in. The first night in the Smokies should have been serene, but as soon as the darkness took over, I felt it, the unease. The forest around me was too quiet. It was like it was holding its breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of my campfire outside. I sat at the picnic table near the fire, trying to relax, but the silence only seemed to grow heavier. I poked at the flames with a stick, hoping they'd somehow keep the stillness at bay. Then I heard it, a whistle, faint at first, like a breeze cutting through the trees, but unmistakably human. I froze, listening. It was tuneless, just a single drawn-out note that seemed to float through the air. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, no movement. No one else was supposed to be this far out. I'd parked in a secluded area of the park, away from the main trails. The whistling continued, soft but constant. "Probably just the wind," I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. It didn't sound like wind, it sounded deliberate. I stood, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and slowly circled the fire. I kept the flames between me and the trees, my eyes darting between the dark shapes of the pines. The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. My heart hammered in my chest, the familiar anxiety clawing its way up my throat. "Who's there?" I called, my voice breaking the thick silence. No response, just another long drawn-out whistle. I grabbed my flashlight from the RV and swept the beam through the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were shadows. No footsteps, no crunch of leaves, Just that damn whistling drifting through the trees like a ghost. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, right? Just a trick of the wind. The mountains could be strange like that, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bottle of whiskey in the back of the RV started to look more and more appealing, but I shoved that thought down. I wasn't here for that. Not this time. To clear my head, I went for a hike, following a trail that wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. For a while it worked. I could almost forget about the night before. Almost. That's when I saw the first marking. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a rough, jagged symbol that looked like a spiral or maybe an eye. I couldn't tell. It didn't look natural, though. It felt intentional, like a warning. I ran my fingers over it, the grooves deep and uneven. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more of the symbols I saw. Spirals, faces, strange runes carved into the trees, all leading deeper into the woods. It felt like they were guiding me somewhere, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find out where. That night, the whistling returned. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to keep my mind off the bottle, when the sound came drifting through the trees. This time it wasn't soft, it was louder, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. My heart pounded in my ears, my mouth went dry. The whistling seemed to circle the campsite, moving slowly but deliberately. It was all I could hear, filling the silence like a haunting lullaby. I turned, and that's when I saw him. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. A man, gaunt and pale, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood motionless, his lips pursed as he whistled that same eerie, tuneless note. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, cutting through the night air like a knife. I took a step toward him, but as soon as I moved, he turned and disappeared into the trees. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something deeper. I felt the urge to chase him, to follow that haunting sound, but my legs refused to move. I stayed by the fire until dawn, too scared to go back inside the RV. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up my gear, grabbed the keys to the RV, and decided I'd had enough of the Smokies. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over, just a dull click. I swore under my breath, popped the hood, and checked the battery. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing wouldn't start. I tried calling Jake, but my phone was dead. I'd charged it the night before, but now it was completely drained. No signal, no service, nothing. The forest around me felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the trees. The whistling started again, faint at first, then growing louder like a taunting melody. I grabbed the bottle from the back of the RV. I wasn't going to drink it. Not yet. But holding it made me feel better, more in control, as if I could use it as a weapon somehow. That night, the stranger came back. I woke up to the sound of whistling, loud, sharp, right outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. He was standing by the fire pit, his pale face illuminated by the flames. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and that awful whistling filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides. He took a step toward the RV, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. I grabbed the bottle, holding it like a club, and stumbled outside. The air was freezing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whistling pierced through my skull, making it hard to think. I raised the bottle, ready to throw it, but then something stopped me. For the first time in days, I heard something else, a voice, faint but real. Jake's voice. "Nick, don't do it." I blinked, shaking my head. The stranger was gone. The whistling had stopped, and there, in the silence, I realized what I had been about to do. The bottle slipped from my hands and shattered on the ground. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whistling was gone, but the fear, the isolation, it wasn't something I could run from. Not out here. Not anywhere. When the sun rose, I tried the RV again. This time, it started. I drove out of the Smokies that morning, not looking back. The whistling stayed behind, lost in the trees, but the memory of it, the temptation, would stay with me. 6 months sober. But this trip taught me something I hadn't been ready to face. Some demons don't live in bottles. They live in the silence, in the spaces we create for ourselves when we're trying to hide from the world. It was still dark when I arrived at Devil's Tower. The silhouette of the monolith rose above the horizon like a jagged alien structure. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky, but the outline was unmistakable. This place had always felt otherworldly, as if it didn't belong to the same earth the rest of us walked on. I parked the RV in the farthest corner of the campground, vast away from the few other visitors scattered throughout the park. I wanted isolation. Needed it, actually, after months of losing myself in work and failing to fix my crumbling marriage. I thought this trip might offer me some clarity. If nothing else, I had my research to keep me focused. Legends of Devil's Tower had fascinated me for years, but one in particular always stuck out. The legend of the Watcher. Native tribes in the region spoke of a spirit that guarded the tower, a being that offered ancient knowledge to those who sought it, but demanded a steep price in return. As a history professor obsessed with ancient folklore, I couldn't resist the lure of that story. I had come to Wyoming to dig deeper into those legends, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might be hiding in the shadows of the tower. I stepped out of the RV, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The towering spires of pine trees loomed around me, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. I unpacked my gear, set up camp, and grabbed my notebook. The plan was simple: hike around the base of the tower, take some notes, and maybe, just maybe, find something that would finally make all the pieces click. As I set out toward the trail that led to the tower, I passed an older man in a park ranger uniform, grizzled with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sharp, though, alert in a way that made me feel like he saw more than the average person. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," I replied, glancing briefly at his name tag. "Tom, you here for the sights or something else?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. I hesitated. "Research, mostly. I'm looking into some of the old Native American stories about the tower." He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward Devil's Tower. "The Watcher, huh?" I stopped. I hadn't mentioned that specific legend. He chuckled softly. "Everyone comes looking for something. But you do well to leave the Watcher alone, son. Some things don't like being disturbed." I tried to brush off his warning with a nervous laugh. "You don't really believe that, do you, Tom?" He didn't smile. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Just be careful. People who go digging too deep around here sometimes find more than they bargain for." With that, he turned and walked back toward the ranger station, leaving me standing there with a pit forming in my stomach. I told myself it was just local superstition, the kind of thing park rangers said to spook tourists. But as I turned my eyes back to the tower, the weight of his words lingered. By midday, I was deep into my hike, circling the base of the tower, taking notes on the surrounding landscape. The towering rock formation loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the forest below. I felt dwarfed by it, like a child standing at the feet of a giant. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a glimmer of sunlight catching on something in the trees. But then I saw them again, faint, glowing orbs between the branches. They were high up, too high to be an animal, and they followed my every movement. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just hovered there, watching. I wanted to dismiss them as some kind of wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them, something intelligent. Forcing myself to continue, I kept walking, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to see if the eyes were still there. They were always just far enough away to keep me wondering, but close enough that I could feel their presence. When I finally made it back to camp, the unease hadn't left me. I sat by the RV, trying to write in my notebook, but my mind kept drifting back to the eyes and the trees, the way they'd followed me, never straying too far, but never coming closer either. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campground in shadow. The tower loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the purple sky. The fire I'd started crackled weakly, the flames flickering as if they, too, were uncertain about staying here. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was a rational man, after all, a professor, a skeptic. But as the night wore on, that skepticism started to feel more like denial. The wind rustled through the trees, and the fire guttered low. Then, just as the last light of the day faded, I heard it. A whistle. It started softly, almost like the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate. A single drawn-out note that drifted through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood, scanning the darkness. The fire cast faint light around the camp. "Hello?" I called, though I wasn't sure what I expected to hear in return. The whistle came again, sharper this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam into the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. The whistling stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat back down, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of the trees, made me bolt upright, expecting to see those glowing eyes or hear that eerie whistle again. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nerves from being out here alone. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, settling deep in my bones. The next day, I set out again, hoping to shake the paranoia that had settled over me. I hadn't gone far when I ran into Julie, a solo traveler I'd briefly noticed the day before. She was standing at the edge of the trail, staring up at Devil's Tower, a strange look on her face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said as I approached, though her tone didn't match her words. There was something off about the way she spoke, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. "Yeah," I replied. "I've been hiking around, looking into the old legends. You know about the Watcher?" She turned to me, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The Watcher? You're looking for it?" I nodded, uneasy. "It's just research." Julie's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The Watcher doesn't like to be found. You know, it watches, but it doesn't want to be seen." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about her was wrong. She seemed too calm, too knowing. The way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked back toward her campsite, leaving me standing there, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, the whistling returned, louder this time, persistent. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, eyes darting between the trees. The whistle circled the campsite, moving closer than further away, like it was testing me, toying with me. Then, just beyond the flickering light of the fire, I saw him. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the woods. His face was pale, hollow-eyed, and his mouth was pursed as the tuneless whistle drifted from his lips. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there, whistling that same eerie note. My chest tightened with a sudden surge of panic. I stumbled back toward the RV, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. When I looked up, he was gone. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of my breath was too loud in the confined space. The next morning, I found footprints around the campsite, small indentations in the dirt, leading in circles around the fire. They hadn't been there before. On the final night, I couldn't take it anymore. The dreams of Devil's Tower had become unbearable, nightmares of the stone pulsing, breathing like a living thing. I dreamt of eyes, hundreds of them, watching me from the shadows, always watching. I had to go to the tower. I had to see it up close. I grabbed my gear and set out under the cover of darkness, the whistle guiding me, pulling me toward the monolith. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stars above twisted and shifted, unfamiliar constellations blinking in and out of existence. As I neared the base of the tower, I saw her again, Julie, standing at the foot of the rock, her face pale and her smile too wide. "The Watcher is waiting," she whispered. "It's always been waiting." The whistle grew louder, piercing through my thoughts, driving me forward. I reached the tower, my hands trembling as I touched the cold stone. And then, out of the shadows, the Watcher appeared. It was a massive, shadowy figure, its body indistinguishable from the darkness, but its eyes glowing, burning orbs that stared into me, through me. It didn't speak with words, but its presence filled my mind, offering me ancient knowledge, secrets of the tower, of the universe, of myself. But the price. I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The more I listened, the more I realized that accepting its offer would mean losing everything. My mind, my soul, everything that made me, me. I stumbled back, tearing myself away from the watcher's gaze. The whistle reached a fever pitch, and I ran. The ground beneath me shifted and warped as the world collapsed around me. I barely made it back to the RV. When I crossed the threshold, the whistling stopped. The forest fell silent. I drove away as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The image of the watcher's eyes burned into my mind. I knew I would never be the same. I've never been a superstitious man. Ghosts, spirits, curses, all of it felt like nonsense. My wife, Sarah, was the opposite. She loved all that mystical spiritual stuff. She'd go on and on about how some places had energies or how she could feel something otherworldly when we'd visit a new place. I used to tease her for it. I didn't mean anything by it. I just never took it seriously. Now, I wish I had. It's been almost a year since Sarah died. I still don't know how to talk about it. I don't talk about it, really. I just packed up the RV one day and decided to drive to get away from everything. Her voice, her smile, the way she used to look at me when I'd roll my eyes at her hippie nonsense. It was all too much to deal with, so I left. I wasn't running from her memory exactly. More like I was trying to outrun the guilt that came with it. Sarah always wanted to visit the desert, especially the Navajo Nation. She said Monument Valley was one of the most spiritual places in the world. I never took her. Work got in the way, or my cynicism did. Either way, it never happened. And now, with nothing but miles of empty road ahead of me, I found myself driving right into that part of the world. Maybe it was my way of making up for it. The landscape around me was beautiful in an eerie, desolate way. Massive red rocks rising out of the desert, mesas silhouetted against the setting sun. The kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant. I parked the RV in a remote spot off an unmarked dirt road. No other campers around, just the endless stretch of desert and the towering rock formations in the distance. It was quiet, peaceful even. I thought maybe I'd finally get a decent night's sleep. I stepped out and walked a bit around the RV, taking in the silence. The air was cool, the sky already darkening with the stars beginning to shimmer into view. Sarah would have loved it. As I sat by the small campfire I'd built, poking at the flames, I thought I heard something in the distance. A howl, maybe? Coyotes. I figured it was nothing unusual in a place like this, but the sound was strange. More like a scream than an animal call. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind. Still, it gnawed at me. Something about the isolation felt different tonight. Heavier. I tried to shake the feeling and headed back into the RV. I locked the door out of habit, but deep down, I knew a lock wouldn't help me feel safe. Not tonight. The first sign that something wasn't right came early the next morning. I'd been outside sipping my coffee and watching the sun rise over the desert when I noticed the tracks. Big, too big to be a coyote. Canine-like, sure, but the prints were deeper, more defined, and there were too many of them. They were circling the RV in a wide arc. I crouched down to get a closer look. The spacing was wrong, like whatever had made them had a stride far longer than any normal animal. I shook my head. Probably a wolf, I reasoned, even though they weren't supposed to roam this part of the desert, or maybe a large dog from a nearby ranch. Either way, I wasn't about to get spooked over some tracks. I spent the day hiking, taking in the massive rock formations and the endless red sands. The wind carried whispers through the valleys, but I ignored it. I refused to let my mind play tricks on me. This was supposed to be my reset, my chance to process everything and finally move on. But that night, as the firelight flickered in front of me, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The coyotes started up again. At least I assumed they were coyotes. But the howls were different this time. Longer, more drawn out, closer. I told myself it was nothing. Tried to focus on the crackling fire, but the unease crept in anyway. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement on the ridge not far from the RV. A figure, tall, humanoid, but wrong somehow. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like it didn't quite know how to walk. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. My heart raced. I stood, trying to peer into the darkness, but there was nothing out there. Just empty desert. The howl stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. I doused the fire quickly and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. I laughed at myself. A grown man terrified by shadows in the night. I was just exhausted, that was all. Grief and exhaustion made you see things that weren't there. I repeated that to myself as I crawled into bed, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. The next morning, I found more tracks. This time, they weren't just around the RV. They led right up to the windows, pressed deep into the sand, circling the vehicle like a predator stalking its prey. I stared at them, unease curdling in my stomach. These prints were bigger than the ones from yesterday. Deeper, too. Something was out here. Something that was getting bolder. I decided to leave. That morning, I packed up my things, double-checked the tires on the RV, and set the GPS for the nearest town. But as soon as I hit the ignition, the engine sputtered. It wouldn't start. "Come on, not now," I muttered, trying again. Nothing. I went outside to check the engine, hoping it was something simple. But when I popped the hood, everything looked fine. There was no reason for the RV to stall like this. Yet, there I was, stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and no way to leave. As the day wore on, that strange feeling of being watched never left. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd catch sight of that figure again. But the desert was still dead quiet. That night, it came closer. I heard it long before I saw it. Footsteps outside the RV, soft at first, but growing heavier, more deliberate. Something was walking around, pacing as if deciding what to do next. I stayed perfectly still inside, listening as the footsteps circled the RV, stopping near the windows. Then came the scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the side of the RV, but the sound was too methodical. It came in short bursts, like claws dragging across metal, testing the strength of the walls. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, slowly pulling back the curtain just an inch. My breath caught in my throat. There, outside in the dark, was the figure I had seen on the ridge. But it was clearer now, standing in the moonlight, just feet from the RV. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. It looked like a man, but its limbs were wrong. Too long, too thin. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its face, it was shifting, contorting, flickering between the face of a man and that of a coyote. It stopped scratching and turned toward the window, as if it could sense me watching. Its eyes, yellow and gleaming, locked onto mine for a moment. Time seemed to freeze. Then it bared its teeth in a sickening grin. I staggered back, heart pounding in my chest, and stumbled toward the door. I had to get out, had to run. But as soon as my hand reached for the latch, I heard it. "Mark?" I froze. "Mark, it's me." The voice, it was Sarah's. Soft, familiar, and filled with the love I hadn't heard in almost a year. I turned slowly, staring at the window. The figure outside had disappeared, but the voice lingered, echoing in the night. "Mark, come outside, please." I shook my head, tears burning in my eyes. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. Sarah was gone. She was gone. But the voice, it sounded so real. I pressed my hands to my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Mark, come to me." I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the scratching returned. More violent this time, as if the creature was trying to claw its way inside. But I didn't open the door. I didn't go outside. The next morning, everything was quiet. No scratches, no footsteps, no voice. I stepped outside, and the desert was calm again. The tracks erased by the wind. The RV started without a hitch. I drove away from Monument Valley, leaving the cursed land behind. But the memory of that night, the voice of my wife, the creature in the dark, has followed me ever since. Some things can't be explained. Some things, I realize now, should never be disturbed. I'm not sure why I chose the Ocala National Forest. It wasn't really on my radar until a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it's because Megan always talked about it, how beautiful the pine forests were, the springs. She was the nature person, not me. She practically begged me to take her camping here once, back when we were still together. I kept putting it off, using work as an excuse. Now here I am, in the middle of the forest alone in my RV, with nothing but my thoughts for company. I needed a break. That's what my doctor said. "Unplug," he told me. "You need to find yourself again," as if I ever had a real grasp of who I was to begin with. 2 weeks into my forced time off, I wasn't any closer to finding peace or clarity. I felt off. I didn't realize how addicted I was to being connected. No emails, no social media, no news feeds, just silence and isolation. It was what I thought I wanted. The first night in the RV wasn't too bad. I parked in a secluded spot far from the main road, surrounded by towering pine trees. I managed to set up camp without any major problems. I had a fire going, and for a little while, I could almost see the appeal Megan always talked about. There was something peaceful about the forest, about the stillness. But it was the kind of stillness that quickly became unsettling when you were alone. By the time the sun set, the silence had grown thick. The only sound was the wind shifting through the pine needles and, every so often, the distant call of an owl. I tried to read one of the survival books I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to her. Megan. We hadn't spoken since the divorce went through. 3 years of marriage dissolved in less than a month. I couldn't even tell you exactly when things went wrong. I just buried myself in work. She begged me to slow down, to reconnect, but I didn't listen. I told myself I was doing it for us, that the stress was worth it in the end. But by the time I realized how much I'd lost, it was too late. The fire crackled as the temperature dropped. I got up to grab my jacket from inside the RV. That's when I first heard it, a soft tapping sound, like something lightly knocking against the side of the RV. I froze, listening. Tap, tap, tap. I leaned against the door, listening harder. The tapping continued, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, scanning the area around the RV. The light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees and shadows. Probably just a branch in the wind, I muttered to myself, though the trees weren't close enough to the RV for that to make sense. I shut the door and locked it. The tapping had stopped, but I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I drifted off, I heard something. Footsteps, rustling things I couldn't explain away as easily as I wanted to. But when I looked outside, the forest was still. The next morning, I found the footprints. They were in the dirt around the RV, large and oddly spaced. Not animal tracks, but not quite human either. They seemed too long, too wide, like someone had been walking on the balls of their feet with unnatural precision. They circled the RV, stopping near the windows before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down to get a better look. The prints were deep, the kind that didn't come from a person casually walking. Whoever or whatever had made them was heavy, deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though there was no one around. I considered leaving, but I wasn't going to let some footprints freak me out. Besides, my RV wouldn't start. No matter how many times I turned the key, the engine just sputtered and clicked. The GPS on my phone was glitchy too, pointing me in all sorts of random directions before it finally went blank. Great, just great. I spent most of the day walking, trying to calm my nerves. I stuck to the trails at first, but as the hours passed, I wandered deeper into the forest. The pine trees stretched up endlessly, their trunks so straight and uniform that I started losing track of where I was. I didn't mind being lost, not at first. It distracted me from the unease that had settled in my chest. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, someone, standing just beyond the trees. I stopped dead, staring at the figure. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally still. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but when I looked again, it was still there. A dark shape, humanoid but wrong, standing among the trees, watching me. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. The figure didn't move. I took a step toward it, and in an instant, it vanished. Not like it walked away, just gone, like it was never there. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the spot where the figure had been, before I finally turned and hurried back toward the RV. That night, the tapping started again, louder this time, more insistent. I lay in bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The rhythmic tapping echoed around the RV, coming from all sides. It sounded like someone or something was circling the vehicle, knocking at the walls, at the windows. I couldn't bring myself to move. Then the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate thuds like boots crunching on gravel. They moved slowly, methodically, pacing back and forth outside the RV. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking, and crawled out of bed. "Stop it," I whispered to myself. "You're imagining things. It's nothing." But I wasn't imagining it. I peered through the window, and there it was, the figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. Its shape was clearer now, a tall, gaunt figure with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing. The tapping grew more frantic, the footsteps louder. My head spun with fear and confusion. What was it? Why was it here? I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice. David. I froze. It was Megan's voice, soft, familiar, and unmistakable. David, come outside. My breath caught in my throat. Megan? I whispered, barely able to speak. Come to me. I stared at the door, my hand trembling on the latch. The voice was so clear, so real, but Megan wasn't here. She couldn't be. It wasn't her. David, please. The voice grew more insistent, more urgent, but something in the tone was wrong, off. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping and footsteps stopped all at once, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the forest felt different, lighter somehow. The figure was gone, and the RV started on the first try. I didn't waste any time. I packed up and drove away, leaving the forest behind as quickly as I could. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, that maybe, just maybe, I didn't leave it behind. Some things can't be explained. Some things I realize now are better left undisturbed. I thought this trip would fix everything. I thought that a week out in the woods, just me and Tyler, would somehow repair the damage from the past year. The divorce hit him harder than it hit me, and that's saying something. I thought maybe, out here in the quiet, away from the distractions of phones in the city, we could connect again. You know, like fathers and sons are supposed to. But from the moment we hit the road, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Tyler barely looked up from his phone the entire drive, earbuds in, scrolling mindlessly. He didn't care about the scenery, didn't care that we were headed to Deadwood Creek, a place I used to go with my own dad when I was his age. It's funny how history repeats itself. My father and I never really saw eye to eye either. He'd brought me out here hoping to teach me how to be a man, how to survive in the wilderness, and now here I was, doing the same with Tyler, hoping the Black Hills would heal something in both of us. I glanced at him as we pulled into the campground. He didn't even notice the tall, dark pines surrounding us, swaying lightly in the wind. A dense fog had settled over the creek, and the sound of water trickling nearby was the only noise besides the RV's engine. It felt different than I remembered, more isolated, lonelier. This is it, I said, more to myself than to Tyler. Cool, he mumbled, still scrolling, not even looking up. I sighed, cutting the engine. After we set up camp, I suggested a short hike to check out the creek. Tyler grumbled, but followed me. The trail was just as I remembered, narrow, winding through the trees with the creek gurgling beside us. There was something peaceful about it, but also something off. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was watching us. We reached the creek's edge, where the water ran fast over the rocks. I crouched down, letting the cool water run over my hand. This place used to be full of miners back in the gold rush days, I said, trying to make conversation. A lot of people came out here looking to strike it rich. Some of them didn't make it out. Tyler shrugged. I guess, he said. I stood up and brushed off my hands, frustrated. You know, you could try enjoying this. He looked up from his phone for the first time and scowled. I didn't ask to come here. I bit my tongue, holding back the argument that wanted to burst out. Let's head back to camp. As we turned to leave, something flickered in my peripheral vision. I stopped, squinting through the trees. There, just at the edge of the clearing, a dim light floated in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, swaying in the wind. Did you see that? I asked, pointing toward the trees. Tyler glanced up, following my gaze. What? That light? It was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I'd imagined it. The fog had thickened while we were by the creek, and the woods were growing darker. Never mind. Let's go. The first night was when things started getting weird. Tyler and I had retreated to the RV after dinner. He was predictably glued to his phone, while I tried to read a book, but the quiet gnawed at me. The stillness outside felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The wind had picked up, and the pines swayed ominously against the backdrop of the night. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a soft, barely there sound, like whispers carried on the breeze. But as I listened, it grew more distinct. Not the wind. Voices. Faint, disembodied voices murmuring just outside the RV. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter. "What?" Tyler didn't even look up. "The voices outside!" Tyler pulled out one of his earbuds, frowning. "What are you talking about?" I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing but fog and trees. But I could still hear the whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like they were coming from the creek. I shook my head. Probably just the wind. Tyler rolled his eyes and went back to his phone, but something about those whispers unsettled me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, the air felt even heavier. Tyler was still distant, sulking around camp, so I suggested another hike, hoping it would clear the tension between us. He reluctantly agreed, and we set off down the trail again, heading back toward the creek. But this time, the unease I'd felt the day before was stronger. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch set me on edge. As we walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was constant now, like eyes were following us from the shadows. Then I saw it again, the light. This time, it was brighter, flickering between the trees ahead of us, moving slowly, like a lantern being carried by an unseen hand. "There it is," I whispered, grabbing Tyler's arm. "Do you see it?" He stopped, frowning. What are you talking about?" The light flickered in and out, growing dimmer before vanishing completely. I took a step forward, but Tyler grabbed my arm. "Dad, let's just go back." I wanted to argue, but the look on his face, the fear in his eyes stopped me. Truth be told, I was scared too. "Yeah, let's go." That night, the footsteps started. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I just managed to drift off when I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching on the gravel outside the RV. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled the RV. They stopped by the window, then moved to the door. Tyler stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. I slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the window, slowly pulling back the curtain. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and there, just at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was tall, dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes like something out of the Gold Rush era. A wide-brimmed hat covered most of its face, but I could see the gleam of a lantern hanging from its hand. The figure stood perfectly still, just watching the RV. I stumbled back, heart racing. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but I couldn't find one. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the fog, the light of its lantern disappearing with it. The next day, Tyler was pale and jittery, his usual teenage indifference replaced with genuine fear. He hadn't seen the figure, but he'd heard the footsteps, and the look in his eyes told me he knew something was wrong. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," I replied. "I'll start the RV. We'll head out." But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then went silent. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. "We're stuck here," I muttered, feeling the weight of dread settle over me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. The figure was back, pacing around the RV, dragging something behind it. I could hear the heavy scrape of metal on gravel, like chains being dragged along the ground. "Dad, what is that?" Tyler whispered, his face pale with fear. I didn't have an answer. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door. "Stay inside," I told him. "No, don't go out there," he begged, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't just sit there, listening to the thing outside. I had to confront it. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The figure was there, standing by the creek, its lantern casting an eerie glow over the water. It didn't move as I approached, just watched me with shadowed eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted, though my voice trembled. "What are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly lifted its arm, pointing to the ground near the water's edge. There, half buried in the mud, was an old, rusted gold pan. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me. The legend, the miner's ghost protecting his lost fortune. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and lifted the pan from the mud. As soon as I touched it, the figure vanished. The footsteps stopped. The whispers and the wind fell silent. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. I stood there for a long time, holding the gold pan, my mind racing. Then, without looking back, I turned and went back to the RV. The next morning, the RV started without a hitch. We left Deadwood Creek behind, and neither of us spoke about what happened. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching us from the trees. I didn't, but I knew, deep down, that something had happened out there. Something I couldn't explain. Something I would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, Tyler and I would be okay. When you spend enough time alone, the silence becomes something else. It's no longer a backdrop, but a living, breathing thing that creeps in around the edges of your thoughts. I thought I liked the silence. That's why I had been living on the road for months, with no one but myself and my RV for company. But this trip to Ocala National Forest was supposed to be different. I needed to reset, to get my head straight. I guess that's what they all say before they lose it. The first day was easy enough. I set up camp on the edge of the forest, not far from one of the swamps that ran through Ocala. I had picked this spot on purpose, far enough from the touristy campgrounds, but close enough to the water to take some good photos. Photography had become my new hobby, something to fill the long stretches of time, something to keep my mind off Rachel. The forest was thick with towering pines and oaks, their branches twisting and closing in overhead. The light filtered through the leaves in a way that made the air seem heavy, almost suffocating, but it was peaceful, or at least I told myself it was. I parked the RV near a clearing, right where the swamp met the woods. The ground was firm enough, and I didn't think much of the water nearby. I had no reason to worry. Not yet. By the time I finished setting up, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing. The air was unnervingly still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. But I didn't mind. Solitude was the whole point. I sat outside for a while, watching the last of the light fade before retreating inside the RV. The hum of the small generator I had hooked up was the only sound breaking the silence. Everything seemed fine. Everything was fine, until the light started flickering. It was subtle at first, just a dimming of the overhead lights. I figured the wiring was faulty. Nothing I couldn't fix. I'm a mechanic by trade, after all. I ignored it, settling in with a book, trying to lose myself in the words. But then the flickering got worse. The lights flashed on and off in rapid succession. The shadows in the RV danced wildly before everything went dark. I sighed, more frustrated than anything, and grabbed my flashlight. After a few minutes of fumbling with the wires, I got the power back on. The lights stabilized, but there was something else. A soft buzzing noise, faint, just at the edge of hearing, like a distant hum. It might have been the swamp, maybe bugs, or just the generator straining, but it set me on edge. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, the unease I'd felt the night before was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. The sunlight was warm, and the swamp shimmered in the early light. I grabbed my camera and set out for a walk, looking for something worth capturing. Ocala was known for its beauty, the kind of untouched wilderness that's hard to find these days. But the deeper I walked into the woods, the more I realized something was off. It started small, little things I could have easily ignored. My compass acting up, the needle spinning lazily before settling in the wrong direction. The buzzing sound from the night before returned, louder now, seeming to come from all around me. I chalked it up to the swamp mosquitoes, maybe, or some malfunction with the generator still ringing in my ears. But when I came back to camp, I noticed the first real sign that something wasn't right. My gear, things I'd left on the picnic table outside, was scattered across the ground, not in a way that suggested wind either. The table had been cleared. My flashlight, the lantern, the tools I'd left out, all of them were scattered in a perfect line toward the swamp. I stopped, staring at the items. Someone had been here, or something. I'm not easily spooked, but my gut told me to get back inside, lock the doors. That night, I sat in the RV, every light on, clutching a lantern just in case the power flickered again. I told myself it was fine. Probably some animal. Bears get curious, right? But when the tapping started, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was soft at first, just a light tapping on the window, like something brushing against it. I glanced over, but didn't see anything. I convinced myself it was the wind, the branches moving in the breeze. But then the tapping came again and again. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The swamp smelled foul, like rot and decay, and the buzzing sound was back, louder than ever. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the clearing, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Large, human-like prints, leading right up to the window of my RV. The mud was fresh, still wet from the swamp, and the prints were clear. But there were no other signs of anyone around, no trails leading away, just those prints, stopping right at the window. Then, nothing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to believe it was someone playing a prank, some camper messing with me. But I hadn't seen another soul since I got here. No cars at the trailhead, no signs of other campers nearby. I hurried back inside, locking the door, but I knew it wouldn't help. The feeling in my gut told me I was being watched. By the third day, I wanted out. I'd seen enough, but when I tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine clicked, but wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but the RV refused to start. Panic settled in. My phone had no signal, this deep in the forest, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. The buzzing sound was louder now, constant, like a low hum in the back of my skull. I packed a bag and decided to hike out. Staying another night was out of the question. The trail was familiar enough, but something was different. The air was thick, stifling, and the swamp seemed to have crept closer. I hadn't noticed it before, but the water was rising, soaking the ground around my campsite. The once dried trail was now a muddy mess, slowing me down as I tried to navigate through the trees. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving between the trees, barely visible in the corner of my eye. I stopped, trying to focus, but every time I turned to look, they were gone. My heart raced. I pushed forward faster now, but the shadows followed me. They stayed just out of sight, flickering in and out of existence, like ghosts. By the time I reached the halfway point, the whispers started. It wasn't loud, just a faint, distant murmur, but it was unmistakable. Voices speaking in a language I didn't understand, too quiet to make out the words. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the swamp, and those damn shadows. The trail blurred before my eyes, and I stumbled, my head swimming. I couldn't think straight. The buzzing, the whispers, it was too much. I needed to get out of here, but no matter which way I turned, the trail led me back to the swamp. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of water and trees. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and then I saw them. Standing at the edge of the swamp, barely visible in the twilight, were the figures. They were tall, too tall to be human, with elongated limbs and dark faces. They didn't move, they just stood there watching me, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows like something half-formed, not fully real. I backed away, my heart pounding, but they didn't follow. They didn't need to. The buzzing sound grew louder, the whispers more insistent. I turned and ran, not caring where the trail led. I just needed to get away. When I finally collapsed back at the RV, drenched in sweat and mud, the sun was already setting. The swamp had crept even closer, the water now lapping at the edges of the clearing. I locked myself inside, every light on, but it didn't matter. I could still hear them. The whispers, the tapping, the buzzing. It all grew louder, closing in on me from every side. I knew what was out there. I'd seen it, and it was only a matter of time before it got in. I sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the moment when the door would creak open, waiting for the shadows to finally step into the light. I don't know how long I sat there, hours, days. The buzzing is in my head now, a constant hum I can't escape. The figures are closer. I can see them outside, just beyond the trees. Their eyes are glowing in the darkness. They're waiting for me, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions. But there I was, driving deeper into Fort Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore. Vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists. But I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer, damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a gray blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow, I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map, it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind. Vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second, I thought I saw a movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. "Hello." My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices, coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time, there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me. Cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer, but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I had come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out, but it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't getting out. I thought a week alone in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest would be the perfect way to clear my head after everything that had happened. The divorce, leaving the military, and that nagging feeling I'd wasted years of my life. I figured some isolation would help me reset, so I packed up my RV, grabbed my gear, and drove deep into the heart of the forest. I should have known better when I first pulled into the campsite. I felt that familiar sense of calm I used to get on deployment. A kind of satisfaction that comes with being prepared for whatever the wilderness might throw at me. The Apache Sitgreaves is a vast, rugged place, and this far in, you don't see many other campers. That's why I picked it. No people, no distractions, just the forest, my RV, and my thoughts. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV at the edge of a tree line overlooking a deep ravine. The view was incredible. The trees spread out like a sea of green, with the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the land. I spent the first day hiking, snapping a few photos of the landscape, and trying to relax. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply, but I welcomed the cold. It felt like the world was trying to numb me, erase the pain I'd been carrying since Rachel left. I lit a small fire, sat by it, and let the quiet settle in. That's what I wanted after all. But the silence felt different out here. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. The first night passed uneventfully, but something woke me around 3 a.m. I sat bolt upright, listening. There it was again, a sound just outside the RV. It wasn't the usual rustle of wildlife or the distant call of an owl. No, this was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought maybe another camper had wandered into my area, but when I peered through the window, all I saw was blackness, the dense trees illuminated only by the faint moonlight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I swept the beam of light across the campsite, scanning the edges of the trees. The footsteps had stopped. Nothing moved. The fire had long since died out, leaving behind only a few glowing embers. No signs of anyone. I convinced myself it was probably just an animal and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, the hairs on the back of my neck stayed up, like I wasn't alone. By the second day, I was already starting to feel the isolation. The weather was turning colder than I'd expected, and to make matters worse, the RV's heater was acting up. It kept cutting out, leaving the inside freezing. At night, I spent hours trying to figure out what was wrong, but it was no use. I'd have to tough it out. I hiked out again that afternoon, looking for some distraction. The forest was beautiful, but in an unforgiving way. The trails were rough, and after a while, I veered off the main path, looking for more secluded spots to explore. I told myself it was for the photography, but really, I just wanted to be somewhere no one could find me. That's when I first saw the carvings. At first, I didn't even notice them. They were subtle, old, just faint marks on the trees. I stopped to take a break and caught sight of one right in front of me. A series of lines etched into the bark, almost like a symbol. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the grooves. It wasn't natural. Someone or something had put it there. As I moved on, I found more of them, scattered and in no particular pattern, but close enough to make me uneasy. They circled the area where I'd set up camp, like some kind of boundary. I shook off the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. This forest was old. People had been here long before me, carving symbols and marks for reasons long forgotten. Nothing to worry about. But I didn't stop worrying. That night, I woke up again, the same time as before, 3 a.m. The footsteps were back, closer this time. The sound was unmistakable, soft but deliberate, like someone walking slowly around the RV, testing the ground with each step. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the RV, paused, then resumed. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight, but hesitated. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something else? The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Then I heard the tapping. Soft, rhythmic taps on the windows. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The taps grew louder, more insistent, coming from all sides of the RV now. I forced myself to get up slowly and crept to the nearest window. My hands shook as I pulled the curtain back just a little. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness outside. Nothing. Just the forest and the shadows. But when I looked again, I saw it. A handprint pressed against the glass. Smudged and distorted, like someone or something had leaned in close. The print was too large to be human. Its fingers were long, unnaturally so, and the palm had an odd, warped shape to it. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there frozen, but the tapping eventually stopped. The air felt thick, like it was pushing down on me, suffocating me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my hunting knife, waiting for the footsteps to return. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I packed my gear and decided to head out early. Whatever had been out there the night before, I didn't want to find out. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but nothing. Dead. The frustration boiled over into panic. I was stranded. I grabbed my map and decided I'd have to hike out to the nearest ranger station, a few miles away. It wasn't ideal, but I couldn't stay here another night, not with whatever was out there. I set off down the trail, moving fast. The cold had seeped into my bones, but I pushed on, hoping to make it before dark. The forest felt different now. Darker, heavier. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow hiding something just out of sight. And the feeling of being watched, it never went away. About halfway to the station, I heard it again. Footsteps that weren't my own. I stopped, listening. My hand rested on the knife at my side. Then I heard a voice. It came from behind me, soft and distant. Liam. I froze. My blood ran cold. Liam, help me. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Rachel's voice, my ex-wife. But she wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I turned slowly. scanning the trees. Nothing. Liam, her voice again, closer this time. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. The voice followed me, calling my name over and over. I clenched my fists, trying to block it out, trying to focus on the trail. But then I saw it. Standing in the middle of the path, not 20 feet ahead. The figure was tall, too tall to be human. Its limbs were long and thin, draped in tattered rags that seemed to shift in the wind. Its face? There was no face. Just a void, a swirling mass of darkness where its features should have been. Its eyes, though. Its eyes were glowing, bright yellow, like two embers burning in the night. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I fumbled for my knife, holding it out in front of me, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no sense to it. This thing wasn't human. It wasn't natural. The Watcher, something from old Apache legends, stories I'd heard long ago, was real, and it had found me. The thing took a step forward, and I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. I don't remember much of the run. It was a blur of trees and shadows, the forest closing in on me as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes. The Watcher's eyes burned into my back. Somehow, I made it to the ranger station. I don't know how, but when I stumbled into the clearing and saw the small building, I nearly collapsed in relief. I burst through the door, breathless and shaking. The ranger inside looked up, startled, but I couldn't form the words to explain what had happened. I didn't need to. When I finally caught my breath, I told him everything. The footsteps, the handprints, the thing in the forest. He didn't believe me, of course. Why would he? He checked my RV later. Saw the scratches and the smudged handprint, but still shrugged it off. Probably just a bear, he said. But I know better. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can still feel it. The Watcher's eyes on me. It's waiting, watching, and it'll follow me no matter where I go. Some things you can't outrun. I came to Red River Gorge to find peace, or at least that's what I told myself. When you've lost everything, when your life's fallen apart, nature feels like the only refuge. The solitude, the silence, they're supposed to help you clear your mind, right? But if I'd known what waited for me in those woods, I might have stayed home. I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead, strapped on my pack, and set off. The first day was perfect. The crisp autumn air had the faint smell of wet leaves, and the colors, God, the colors were dazzling. I'm a photographer by trade now, trying to make a name for myself since leaving teaching. The leaves, in their fiery oranges and deep reds, made the perfect backdrop for my shots. It was the kind of beauty you could get lost in. I guess that's what I was hoping for. The trail was tough, though, harder than I expected. The steep climbs had my legs burning, and my pack felt heavier with every step. I could feel the camera bouncing against my back, reminding me why I was here. The plan was simple. A week alone in the wilderness. Just me, my gear, and enough food to get by. No distractions, no people, no Rachel. I shook the thought out of my head and kept walking, focusing on the landscape instead. The river was nearby, its faint gurgle a common soundtrack to the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time the sun started to dip, I was more exhausted than I should have been. My muscles ached from the unfamiliar terrain, and blisters had already formed on my heels. I set up camp by the river. I'd brought an old tent that had seen better days, but I figured it would hold up fine for a week. The stove, a clearance sale special, was already giving me trouble. The flame flickered weakly, as if unsure of itself, and I ended up eating half-cooked noodles before giving up and settling into my sleeping bag. That first night, I didn't sleep well. At first, it was just the usual branches rustling, the wind whispering through the leaves. But around midnight, I heard something strange. It sounded like a voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. I sat up, listening. It came again, too soft to make out words, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence like speech. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe distant campers, but there had been no cars at the trailhead. I was alone out here. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day was harder. The trail was steep, and my legs were sore from the day before. The scenery was still breathtaking, but the deeper I went into the gorge, the more oppressive it felt. The trees grew closer together, their branches blocking out the sun, casting long shadows that made the woods seem darker than they should have been. It was around midday when I first saw it. I was setting up a shot of a rocky outcrop, the kind of thing that might make a good feature for my portfolio, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was that primal sensation, the one that tells you you're not alone. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and there it was, just within the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. At first, I thought it was a person, someone tall and thin, wearing a long tattered coat, but something was off. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "You're just seeing things," I muttered to myself. "It's nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, clearer. I could almost make out words, but they were garbled, like someone trying to speak underwater. I lay in my tent, wide-eyed and tense, listening. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to swirl around the camp, circling me. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped open the tent, and shined the beam into the woods. There was nothing, just the trees, the river, the empty night. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, my mouth frozen. I was too scared to make a sound, as if acknowledging it would make it real. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap. My breath came in sharp, visible puffs as I scanned the darkness. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, human-shaped and fresh, pressed into the damp earth around my tent. They hadn't been there before I went to bed. My heart raced as I knelt down to examine them. They circled my campsite as though someone or something had been watching me, walking around while I slept. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I backed away slowly, stumbling as I scrambled back into the tent and zipped it up as fast as I could. I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers continued, relentless, until dawn. By the third day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, and every step felt like agony. My legs were leaden, my pack seemed twice as heavy, and my mind was unraveling. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart into overdrive. I wanted to leave, but I was too far in now. It would take me days to hike back out, and the thought of turning around filled me with a strange sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I felt the gorge itself didn't want me to leave. Like it was holding me here, drawing me deeper into its clutches. I kept walking, pushing through the exhaustion, trying to ignore the whispers that still echoed in my head. By midday, I found myself near the river again, at a small clearing. I decided to stop and rest, hoping the sight of the water might calm me. But as I sat there, staring at the rippling current, I saw something across the riverbank. The figure. It was standing on the opposite shore, half hidden by the trees. I could see it more clearly now. Tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. It wore tattered grayish rags that fluttered in the breeze, but its face was a blur, a smudge of darkness that seemed to shift and warp as I stared at it. My pulse quickened, and my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I raised the lens, focused on the figure, and snapped the shutter. The moment I did, the figure flickered like static on an old TV. 1 second it was there, and the next, it wasn't. Gone. I lowered the camera, my hands trembling. My gut told me to leave, to get the hell out of here, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. The whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. They filled the air around me, a cacophony of voices speaking over each other, too fast to understand. And then I felt it, a cold, sharp pressure on my shoulder, like fingers pressing into my skin. I screamed, scrambling to my feet and backing away from the riverbank. The coldness followed me, clinging to me like invisible hands, trying to pull me down. I ran blindly, recklessly, away from the water, away from the voices. I didn't stop until I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded, but the cold lingered, sinking deep into my bones. I was shaking, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat by my dying campfire, clutching my camera, my eyes darting nervously around the darkened woods. The whispers had returned, but they were softer now, distant. I knew I wasn't alone. The figure, the wraith as I'd come to call it, was out there, watching me, waiting for me. I tried to rationalize it, but there was no denying the truth anymore. This wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't a trick of the light or the wind playing games with my mind. There was something in these woods, something ancient, something angry. On the 5th day, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking with nervous energy. I didn't care how long it took. I had to get out of this place. But the gorge had other plans. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, the path seemed to shift beneath my feet. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the way out. Every turn brought me back to the same spot, the same trees, the same stretch of river. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of endless woods. And then I saw it again. The wraith. It stood in the distance, half hidden by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I raised my camera again, my only weapon, and snapped the shutter. The wraith flickered, its form distorting, but it didn't disappear. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its tattered clothes trailing behind it like smoke. The whispers grew louder, the air around me colder, thicker. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. The wraith didn't stop. It came closer and closer until it stood just feet away from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Its face, a swirling mass of darkness, hovered inches from mine. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke, "You can't leave." When I woke up, I was lying on the riverbank, soaked to the bone. The wraith was gone, but the memory of its voice lingered in my mind, an echo that refused to fade. I don't know how I made it back to the trailhead. I don't remember the walk, the drive, or even packing up my gear. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back to Red River Gorge. Some places weren't meant to be explored. I bought the trailer last spring, secondhand from a guy who was moving to Florida. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. That trailer was supposed to be my sanctuary. After the stress of the divorce and losing my job, I needed a break from everything. The thought of spending a few nights by myself, parked somewhere quiet, far from the chaos of my life, sounded like exactly what I needed. So, I headed to a place that had been calling to me ever since I'd heard about it, Lake Lanier. People talked about the lake in hushed tones around the campfire when I was younger. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed that entire towns had been drowned when they flooded the valley to create the lake in the 50s, cemeteries included. The dead, they said, were still down there, restless, under the water. I never paid much attention to the stories. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. But after everything I'd been through lately, the idea of driving to the lake and parking my trailer on a secluded shore was more appealing than ever. A fresh start, even if just for a few days. I found a spot at the edge of a small, isolated cove, far from any of the designated campgrounds or busy boat ramps. Just the quiet lap of water against the shore, and the trees standing tall and silent. It was perfect, peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I parked the trailer and set up camp, watching as the late afternoon sun shimmered on the surface of the lake. That first evening, I cracked open a beer and settled into my lawn chair facing the water. The silence was deep and soothing, almost too quiet. I could barely hear the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, birds singing, frogs croaking, just the faintest trickle of the water lapping against the shore. At first, it was comforting. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. But then, as dusk fell, the air started to feel heavy, as if something unseen had slipped into the space around me. I ignored it. Just nerves, I thought. I was stressed, burned out, and needed to relax. But even as the sun slipped below the horizon and the lake turned dark and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the first night, I heard the sound. A soft splash, like someone wading through the shallows right outside my trailer. It was nearly midnight, and the fire had long since died out. I was tucked inside the trailer, half asleep, when I heard it again. Splash, then silence. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Probably a fish, I told myself, or some animal come down for a drink. But it wasn't. The splash came again, and this time it was louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking through the water slowly. I crept to the window and peeked out, my breath catching in my throat. The moon was bright enough to light the water, and for a second I swore I saw a shape, something dark, standing in the shallows just a few feet from shore. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, like a person, but the figure was strange. Its head was too low, like it was hunched over, and its limbs looked wrong. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I stood frozen, heart racing, as I stared out at the still water. Nothing. Just the calm surface of the lake, as if nothing had been there at all. I didn't sleep much after that, tossing and turning, convinced it was just my imagination. I'd been through a lot lately. It was bound to mess with my head. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the day fishing. Even though I didn't catch much, I kept telling myself I was just tired, that the isolation was getting to me. But then, when I walked back to the trailer in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. Footprints, small barefoot prints in the mud, leading from the water's edge up toward my trailer. They were small, like a child's. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were my own tracks from earlier. But I hadn't been barefoot, and they didn't look right. They crisscrossed each other, as if someone had wandered back and forth around and around before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down, running my fingers over the prints, a chill creeping up my spine. There was no one else out here, no one but me. I looked up at the lake, at the still, murky water. It seemed darker than before, as if the light couldn't quite reach beneath the surface. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. Maybe an animal had left the prints, or maybe someone else had camped here before I arrived. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, the footsteps returned. I had just turned off the lights and settled into bed when I heard it, the soft, wet squelch of footsteps moving slowly around the trailer. My heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight and the small hunting knife I had brought with me, inching toward the door. The footsteps stopped, just outside. I flicked on the light and threw open the door, shining the beam of the flashlight out into the night. Nothing, just the trees, the water, and the faint rustle of wind. But I knew I'd heard it. I wasn't imagining things. I'd heard footsteps circling the trailer. Bare footsteps, like someone creeping through the mud. I locked the door and stayed up for hours, listening. But there was nothing else that night, just silence. By the next morning, my nerves were shot. I drove into town to grab supplies and shake off the tension. While waiting at a local diner for my food, I overheard some locals talking about the lake, about the old towns that had been submerged when the dam was built, and about the cemeteries that hadn't been fully relocated before the waters rose. "The dead don't rest easy out there," one of the older men said, his voice low. "You spend too much time by the lake at night, and you'll start hearing them. You'll hear them call your name, luring you down to the water." I felt the cold sweat trickle down my back. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, never had. But the way the man spoke, as if he'd seen something, felt something, unnerved me. I left the diner and drove back to the lake, more on edge than before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dread returned. It was stronger now, more insistent, like something in the air had shifted. I sat by the fire, staring at the lake, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The water, dark and still, seemed to be hiding something beneath its surface. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint, almost indistinguishable from the breeze, but there, whispering my name. "Rick." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared out at the water, the fire crackling behind me, and the voice came again, soft and distant. "Rick." It wasn't just the wind. It was real. I stood up, backing away from the shore, my pulse racing. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the water, my hands trembling. That's when I saw them. Figures, dark, pale shapes just below the surface of the water. They were small, human-shaped, but their faces were twisted and distorted, like they were drowning but frozen in place. The water around them rippled slightly, as if they were trying to reach for me, but they stayed submerged, watching. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at the figures, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. I was losing it. I had to be. I turned and bolted back to the trailer, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife I'd grabbed. The footsteps came again that night, louder, more insistent, and the voice kept calling my name. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how irrational it seemed or how crazy the story would sound when I got back home. I wasn't staying another night by that cursed lake. I packed up the trailer and tried to start the truck, dead. The battery was completely drained, even though I hadn't left anything running overnight. My hands shook as I tried again, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the vehicle. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I tried to think. I could hike back to town, but it would take hours, and the thought of leaving the trailer and whatever safety it offered seemed like a death sentence. The water called to me, louder now, the whispers coming more frequently. They wanted me in the lake. I grabbed a set of tools from the back of the trailer, hoping to get the engine working again. As I worked, I felt eyes on me. I could sense them, the figures standing just at the water's edge, waiting. The temperature dropped, the air growing thick and cold as I frantically tried to get the battery to respond. Finally, after what felt like hours, the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I jumped into the truck, threw it into gear, and peeled out of the campsite, the trailer jerking behind me. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. They were there, standing at the edge of the lake, their pale, distorted faces watching me as I sped off into the night. I never went back to Lake Lanier. I haven't told anyone about what I saw or what happened, but even now, months later, when I lie awake at night in my own bed, far from the lake, I can still hear it. The faint sound of whispers calling my name. The darkness of the Juan National Forest stretched before me like an endless abyss. The trees, as ancient as the land itself, rose tall and imposing, blocking any light that might escape from the stars. This was the kind of place I used to love, complete isolation, pure, untouched nature. I was there to study the behavior of some rare owl species and take a few nighttime photographs. At least, that was the plan. At first, everything was as expected. I'd parked my trailer in a remote part of the forest, far from tourist trails and campgrounds. The silence that surrounded the area was reassuring. I was used to this kind of environment and loved the challenge of being completely alone, immersed in nature. But that night, the silence felt different, thick, heavy. I finished setting up camp and prepared for a night of observation. The wind blew gently, and the leaves made that soft, soothing sound that always accompanied the beginning of a night in the forest. For some reason, though, I felt a slight sense of unease, as if something was watching me. I ignored it. I knew solitude could play tricks on the mind. I had always been a skeptic. I wasn't the type to fall for superstitions or local legends. I went into the trailer to adjust my equipment. I wanted to set up the cameras and recorders to capture sounds and images of the animals that, with luck, would appear around me. But the first sign that something was wrong came then. My cameras started malfunctioning. The display kept flickering, and the images came out distorted, as if something was interfering with the sensors. I looked at the cameras, confused. They were charged, working perfectly before I left home. I tried again, but the problem persisted. I thought it might be magnetic interference, some kind of atmospheric anomaly that could happen in more remote areas. I decided to step outside and check my phone's GPS. But to my surprise, it had no signal. Okay, I thought. It's not the end of the world. I'm in a remote area. It might just be a matter of finding a higher spot to get a signal. But as the night went on, things really started to get strange. I was outside adjusting the camera lens when I heard the first sound, a low, guttural noise echoing between the trees. It was hard to tell what it was, something deep in the forest. It sounded distant, but it was enough to put me on alert. I knew all kinds of wild animal sounds, but this wasn't familiar. I swept the darkness with my flashlight, trying to locate the source of the sound, but all I saw was the faint glow of trees and the light reflecting off the leaves. The wind seemed to have stopped suddenly, leaving the forest completely still. There wasn't even the sound of insects or owls. Absolute silence. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. I knew that sometimes nature could be like this, Predators could silence the environment, scaring off smaller animals. But even by predator standards, that silence was oppressive. I decided to head back to the trailer and wait until morning. Maybe it was just exhaustion talking, and the darkness made everything scarier than it really was. After all, I had spent the whole day exploring the place. I laid down on my bunk, trying to relax, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake it. Then I heard the sounds again. Footsteps. I knew the sound of animal footsteps well, but these were different. Heavy, long, with a deliberate drag. I got up slowly, my senses on high alert. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the door. Something was moving outside. With my heart racing, I carefully opened the trailer door, and the flashlight illuminated the ground around me. Claw marks. The ground was scratched, as if something large had passed through. I stood still for a moment, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It could have been a bear or a wolf, but the marks were deep, as if made by something strong enough to tear the bark off a tree with a single swipe. A slight pressure began building in my chest. I wasn't easily scared, but what was happening here was strange. Very strange. The next day, I drove to the nearest town. I needed fuel for the generator, and I also wanted to ask a local if they had seen any signs of bears or wolves in that part of the forest. I walked into a small grocery store and casually mentioned to the owner, an elderly man, about the marks and the strange silence from the night before. He suddenly grew serious. His dark eyes stared at me, and he said in a grave voice, "That's not a bear, son. That's the shadow of the Black Forest." Confused, I asked what he meant by that, and with a worried expression, he told the story of an ancient entity that wandered the forest on nights with a new moon. They say it feeds on travelers' fear, plays with them until it drags them into the darkness. No one who meets it comes back the same. He spoke of the shadow as something that couldn't be defeated, only avoided. I smiled a little, unnerved, thanked him, and returned to the trailer. Small-town superstitions, I thought. Maybe he just wanted to scare me, or perhaps he was exaggerating local legends. But deep down, something inside me felt uneasy. I decided to stay alert, but still rational. That night, the tension grew. The malfunctions with my equipment continued. The trailer's lights began flickering. The generator kept failing. And then I saw them. Shadows moving between the trees. Fast, but impossible to make out clearly. Something was out there. I stood up and walked to the window, flashlight pointed into the darkness. And that's when I saw it for the first time. The shadow. It was a tall, misshapen figure, almost humanoid, but its arms were long and grotesque, and its eyes glowed with a pale yellow light. It stood about 30 yards away, motionless, between the trees. I felt my blood turn to ice. It was completely still, watching me. The silence returned, heavier than ever. I froze, unable to move for a few seconds. When I blinked, it was gone. My rational mind began to crumble. This couldn't be real. I must have been tired. My mind was probably creating these things. But at the same time, my body knew something dangerous was out there, something I couldn't explain. The following hours were a blur of frustrated attempts to fix the situation. I tried restarting the trailer, adjusting the systems, but everything failed. The light flickered and went out. The wind, which had been still earlier, began to blow fiercely. But instead of easing the tension, the wind carried whispers, distant voices, as if the forest itself were trying to tell me something. But I couldn't understand. The shadow appeared again. This time, closer. Its eyes watching me from the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was getting closer, slowly, playing with me. Panic rose in my throat. It was surrounding me, feeding off my fear, just as the old man at the store had said. I tried to leave. I started the trailer's engine, but it died almost instantly. I had no choice but to face this thing. I grabbed an improvised torch and stepped outside, my hands trembling. I had no idea what to do, but I knew I had to try something. The shadow moved again, floating between the trees. My eyes couldn't focus on it for long, but I knew it was getting closer. It was as if it was wrapping me in its darkness, draining my sanity bit by bit. Then I remembered. The fear. It fed on fear. I needed to control it. I had to force my mind to work. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to calm my breathing. The panic began to fade, slowly but surely. I opened my eyes and it was there, standing just a few feet away. But something had changed. It stopped. My controlled breathing, my slowing heartbeat, seemed to weaken it. The glow in its yellow eyes dimmed. I didn't know how, but it seemed to be working. With one last desperate attempt, I got back into the trailer and started the engine. It sputtered, choked, but then roared back to life. I hit the gas, the sound of the engine drowning out the whispers in the wind. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shadow slowly fading into the darkness. I left the forest that night without looking back. I didn't know what that thing was or how I had escaped. But I knew one thing. I would never return to that forest. The shadow of the Black Forest was real, and I was glad to still be alive to tell the tale.